I'm here at the Rembrandt House Museum in Amsterdam with Angelito, the printmaker here, who does etching demonstrations in the very studio that Rembrandt would have used during his lifetime. Angelito, I'm hoping that you can walk us through an etching today.
Definitely. In order to do any of these techniques, you first would need a metal plate. Usually copper is what is used, and I've got copper in my hands right here. And then you just either scratch, get a drawing, or engrave into the plate. Now those three techniques, let me start with the most difficult one. The very first technique is called the engraving technique. So this needle right here, we could call it an engraving needle, but it's usually called a burin. The burin has a V-shaped triangular tip, V-shaped tip sloping down, and a very long and flat back. Now this needle right here was an artisan needle, so it was a craftsmanship needle. So jewelers would most often use this specific needle. If you were unexperienced, this needle was quite difficult in use. Let me show you how this needle is used. So we have a flat side. You would lay the flat side down onto our copper plate. Now I'm going to hover just a tiny bit over it as to not ruin this beautiful plate right here and get new scratches into it. You'd push the point inwards, then you'd tilt the engraving needle back flat, and then you'd almost dig or shovel the metal out the plate like so. Now you can imagine if I were to apply a lot more pressure, I'm quite literally digging and gouging that copper out of the metal out of the plate. When I'm creating this motion, I'm pushing the copper, you create very tiny copper curls or copper shavings on the top side of the slope, and you'll be left with very straight, very controlled lines, such as the lines in the middle right here. Now what is very difficult to see on a 2D piece of paper, the lines in the middle, or the lines that the engraving needle creates, are very deep. Now the second technique is going to be just a little bit more fun for me, since I have a copper plate which I like to ruin, and I will do this with the dry point technique. So the dry point needle is my favorite technique, but it's also going to be the most aggressive. Instead of digging into the copper plate and really removing the copper out of the plate, the dry point needle, you'll have to scratch directly into it like so, and you'll get your lines this way. You might notice that the copper isn't coming out of that plate, but the copper still needs to be moved somewhere in order for me to draw all of these lines. So what is it exactly that this dry point needle does, and what makes it so aggressive? So instead of pushing the copper out of the plate, it pushes it to the side, creating almost like brambles alongside these lines. These brambles are very tiny, minuscule, even metallic edges. With the naked eye, very difficult to spot. But once we start to create an impression, we'll be left with a vastly different line. So you have to imagine that the brambles alongside these lines are a perfect place for ink to kind of flow into, to keep sitting into. And so as we create an impression, we'll be left with the lines on your right-hand side. Very soft, very velvety, a feathery, a much more expressive line. And then, of course, last but not least, we have our traditional etching technique. This right here is what we call an etching needle. The etching needle, or with the etching technique, we would yet again grab a copper plate. But this time we do it slightly different. This time we would apply an edge ground on top of it beforehand. Now this edge ground is just a very soft mixture. In Rembrandt's time it was created out of three major components. The first component is going to be bitumen. If you are unfamiliar, you could see it as a relative to tar. So nowadays bitumen holds our asphalt roads together. Our second component is going to be, let's say, beeswax right here. And then we have resin from a tree, from a pine tree. Melt them down, combine them together, and then you'll be left with a very soft mixture. Now how soft, in fact? As you can see, in order for me to now create a line in here, it's almost as if I'm flowing with a pen over a piece of paper. It's very easily done. Since we've only removed this top layer, the lines and the lines created right here are not deep enough for ink to flow into. So if we are using this etching technique, we would need to add a following step. This following step involves a lot more beeswax and creating a homemade bucket out of this beeswax. Quite crucial that your bucket was airtight, because now we're going to give it a bath of acid. The longer you would let it sit for, the deeper your lines would become, and of course the darker your lines would become. The deeper your lines are, the more ink is able to flow into it, and naturally they're going to be darker. Shall we move on to creating the impression?
Yes.
Now before you can actually start, it was highly advisable to heat up your plate. Obviously, Rembrandt didn't have such a beautiful heating element that I'm working with. He would just go downstairs to the kitchen where a fire is always burning. Now, the reason that you want your plate a little warmer is in order for this very thick, very robust ink to be able to slightly melt into the lines, and it will make it a lot more easy to distribute and move around. So let's start with grabbing a bit of the ink, and as you can see, I'm just going to cover the entirety of our plate with this beautiful etching ink. This might take quite a while since we've chosen a larger landscape. Before we can wipe, however, we first need to make sure that all of the lines and engravings that we've created into a plate is actually filled up with ink. Which is why I'm going to use or make use of this particular tool. We call it a dabber. Very simply showcase why this is called a dabber. I'm now going to gently dab all of the ink into the lines and grooves, really making sure that all of the depth has been filled up with our ink. And these lines are quite crucial actually, since these lines are eventually what is going to give us that beautiful print. And so they do need to be filled up. If you want a detailed print, this step cannot be skipped. So now I've made sure that the lines have been filled. You can imagine if I were to create an impression just like it is, you would be very disappointed in me. It would come back like this as well. And we wouldn't be able to see that beautiful three trees. I would have wasted your times now, of course. I'm not a big fan of that. So this might seem counterintuitive, but I'll have to undo most of our hard work. I'm gonna do this by scraping off the surface layer of ink. And this process will slowly and magically bring our plate back to life again, revealing the beautiful three trees underneath. All right. As you can see, the three trees is almost fully visible again. I'll just have to clean it up just a tiny bit more. And you guessed it, I'm gonna use yet another tool. Do you recognize this cloth?
This is cheesecloth.
It is, yes. So farmers would use this exact same type of cloth. Now, I'm not gonna age cheeses with you today, but we use this fabric because it's created out of linen. If I were to use a different type of fabric, let's say fiber, right, little hairs, all of the little hairs will start to stick to the ink. It will become a mess. Now, linen, basically fiberless. So this is the perfect tool for scrubbing. Now, linen will also not absorb the ink, so it's not mandatory to grab a clean slate. The linen has a lot of holes, so the cloth itself has a lot of holes, a lot of breathability, so I'm going to use it as a scrubbing tool, and the little holes will grab the ink along its way. So let's start with trying to smooth it out. Now, as an artist, this stage is the most fun. You can really play with the clair-obscur, being the play on lighting and darkness. The more ink I remove, the lighter the part becomes, and the less ink I remove, the darker it becomes. So the tarlatan will do its best. It is not able to remove all of the ink. So once I'm done with this process right here, I'll have what we call a plate tone, which is just leftover ink on the background of the plate, which adds much more drama and much more emotion to your piece. But of course, we do want to remove that plate tone today. So now that most of the ink is off, I'm going to move on to a smaller piece and so be much more precise with where I want the ink to be and which parts I want the ink to be removed. Okay. You've seen how much I've actually scrubbed it, and the tarlatan is unable to remove all of it, which is why I'm going to use crushed up chalk. So I'm going to gently dab my hand in this chalk. I'm going to shake the excess chalk off. And now simply gently hitting the surface of our plate. Now, as you can see,
what a difference, my goodness.
The ink is now being transferred to my hand, and that plate tone will essentially be removed at the end of the stage.
So we're now at the press, and it's time to actually create the etching.
So we'll lay our plate right here, and then I'm going to grab a piece of paper. The paper needs to be just a little damp, not wet. Indeed, since when the paper is a little damp, you can see that the paper has a lot more mobility, a lot more flexible, which is quite important and crucial because we're going to expose this paper to a lot of pressure. So the most important step is actually centering our paper and then lay it down our etching. So now we have to create kind of a protective barrier for our paper and the plate. So we have two pieces of felt, one underneath and one over, and this will make sure that it doesn't take a lot of force. Once I start rolling, I cannot stop. And I'm gonna do it fairly slow as well. I do not want to go too quickly, but I also do not want to go too slow. So right here is where our plate is actually meeting that pressure. And so for me, it feels a lot more difficult to roll at this point. Let's have a look. So let's uncover this felt. And then the first thing, we cannot see a lot except for the edges of the plate. So what actually happened, the paper has now literally been pressed into a plate, and now a literal impression has been created. Now the moment of truth, I'm also very excited for this moment. I'm not able to x-ray through it, so when I pull it off, I really hope that it turns out the way that we want it to be.
Oh, wow. That is unbelievable. Well, this has been absolutely spectacular. Thank you for walking us through the process and showing us what a day in the life of Rembrandt may well have been like when he was creating etchings. It's an incredible thing that you're doing here at the Rembrandt House Museum, teaching people about etchings and about Rembrandt's life and work. So again, thank you so much.
You're very much welcome, John.